Listen up. It's time for a politically entertaining exclusive interview.
Joining us today on Politically Entertaining, he is the United States Senator from South Carolina. He's one of two African-American senators currently serving. The other happens to be the co-sponsor of the bill that we'll be discussing today, Investing in Opportunity Act. Senator Tim Scott, thank you for joining us today, sir.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure to be on the show with you, both of you guys, and look forward to the conversation.
This is a big deal for us, so we really appreciate it. I wanted to start off first. I mentioned your bill on a previous episode, and I just wanted to know, before we actually got into what the bill actually does, was there a particular constituent or a story that you read that made you want to come up with a bill like Investing in Opportunity Act?
Really, I think it comes from my own personal journey, to be honest with you. I grew up in a single-parent household, raised in poverty. My neighborhoods consistently had very high unemployment, very high high school dropout rates, and also just mired in hopelessness. And I've always been a part of a process to understand and appreciate how to free other kids like myself from the quagmire pit of poverty. And one of the ways that I understand after researching it and having lived it was the necessity of looking for capital that can be infused in communities without necessarily gentrifying those people who live in those communities. So it's finding a way to strike a balance by bringing new private sector dollars into neighborhoods or into areas that could spark development and entrepreneurship and free some of the kids like myself from the quagmire pit of poverty.
That is very interesting. When I mentioned your bill, the episode prior to that, I had read an article. It was titled "The Eviction Economy," and it was talking about what poor people go through. And I made the statement then. I was telling Frank and I was telling the audience that there's really no incentive for politicians to really address poverty, and we were questioning how could we really tackle poverty. And then I read your bill the following week, so it's like, here's Senator Scott to kind of shut me up and give me an answer on that. So for the audience, if you could, I wanted you to, in your own words, since you're the man that wrote the bill, explain how it works and how you hope that it'll directly impact financially distressed communities in poor neighborhoods.
Yeah, so the simple approach to the legislation from my perspective is to think about people who make a profit. That profit requires a tax. We call that typically a capital gains tax. If there's a way to encourage people, instead of paying the money to the government immediately in a capital gains tax, why not take that money and reinvest it into communities, giving the person who makes the gain a 7-year deferral on paying the tax so they can do something good in a community, and then they still owe the tax. But they get the deferment so they can make a long-term investment in creating jobs, revitalizing communities, rehabilitating houses, giving kids, like so many of us growing up today, as I was 30 years ago, giving those same children hope and opportunity through these private sector dollars coming into these neighborhoods and directing those funds in such a way that we see the spark that creates opportunities. And by doing so, the person who makes the gain or the profit gets to defer the tax, but they have to do something long-term in these communities in order to defer the tax because you still owe it. So I think of it as a win-win. They defer the tax, which gives them a chance to do some good work in some distressed communities. We use the definition of distressed communities that is defined by the new market tax credit that creates low-income areas. We use those low-income area designation to bring more resources in those communities, and by doing so, I think long-term we'll have more money to the government because there will be more profit to be made in those communities. There will have more people coming out of poverty with a passion of reinvesting in their own communities. When I started my business, I hired people from my community to work in and run my business. So it works. I've lived it. I've studied it statistically. So now we just need to deploy it on a nationwide basis.
Senator Scott, this is Frank. I have a question for you. So one of the things you mentioned, and I think is great, is how you're putting money in the distressed communities to help develop the local community. Now, one interesting part of the bill that I read was the bipartisan working across the aisle that you have.
Yeah.
With Senator Cory Booker, and I find that very interesting because a lot of times we hear about rancor and stuff in Washington about politicians can't work together, they can't accomplish things. I mean, why is this something that we don't see more of? I mean, this is a great bill, great act, but when people are upset about Congress or Congress has a low approval rating, why do we not see more collaboration like this? This is something that's sorely needed in many places, not just South Carolina, but certainly, like you mentioned, nationwide.
Well, we need more people like you guys in the media and in the communications business giving air to the fact that there are bipartisan coalitions working on behalf of people. Cory Booker and myself see ourselves as servants to the people, not just leaders of the people. I think you first need to serve people before you know how to lead them. It's a Jesus model of leadership, servant leadership, putting the servant first. And so Cory and I have been teaming up on education legislation, on apprenticeship programs, as well as this latest iteration in looking for ways to address people living in poverty, to address the issue of poverty. Because while he came up in a very affluent middle-class neighborhood, he has a passion for people. He moved into the housing projects, the high-rises, when he was the mayor of Newark. He did that voluntarily so he could have an understanding and appreciation. Well, I lived in the hood involuntarily. I was raised there. So we both look for ways, Frank, to make a difference because we have had the experience. So often people want to do good and may not fully appreciate how because they haven't always or maybe ever lived there. So I think those of us who've lived there and been there, we have a responsibility to shoulder the burden on behalf of the next generation, who then will pay it forward and pay it back.
I think that's just great. And another thing I wanted to ask you is, obviously, as an African-American and a Republican senator, certainly there are certain stereotypes in the African-American community that sometimes go along with the Republican Party. Now, obviously, everything you're doing is totally in line with what needs to be done. What are some of the myths that you can debunk as far as with you doing this bill as an African American working in distressed communities that will let people know that, hey, the Republican Party is definitely for all people, especially distressed and poor people, where sometimes there's this how would you say, mythology or that there's like the Republican Party doesn't care about poor people and all they care about is the 1%. Can you just kind of dispel some of that and talk about why this bill can do that as well?
Yeah, Frank, I'll tell you that it's pretty clear. We fought, our parents and grandparents fought during the Jim Crow days, during the 60s, for each of us to be judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin. I think it's so important for us to judge each elected official as an individual. We all choose our parties for a number of reasons. I chose mine because I think consistently the Republican Party is the party of small business, the party of the military, the party of a faith-filled community. So it works for me. But my agenda is clearly an agenda that looks at the people living paycheck to paycheck, and I'm looking for ways to alleviate the pressure and the pain. My mom worked 16 hours a day, 3 days a week at times, to keep us off of welfare. She did everything in her power to give me the model of someone who went to work and came home, so that, as she would say, so that I would not just be average. She wanted me to be more than average. I'm living my mother's American dream standing on her shoulders, and I'm taking her with me. And so I honestly think that there are a ton of Republicans who have similar stories who may not look like any of us. We all three look a little bit alike. But the fact of the matter is that if you have the passion for people, you should express that in your legislation. And so whether it's my legislation on education, on apprenticeship programs so you can earn and learn, because sometimes college isn't for everyone. We should have respect and dignity in all work. So I want to make sure that anyone who wants to work feels the power of dignity working on their behalf. I think of my legislation that I co-sponsor with Mike Lee that basically says if you're a mom or anybody and you're working full-time like my mother was and you have kids at home, maybe flexible work hours should be encouraged so that you can go home for a couple hours and finish the work at night. We should do some common sense things that says we care about you, the person working paycheck to paycheck. That's not a Republican thing or a Democrat thing. Let's call it a human being thing. And so I'm about that.
We are talking to Senator Scott, Republican from South Carolina, and we're discussing Investing in Opportunity Act. Senator, I wanted to ask you, again, when I mentioned your bill and I read up on it, I saw that it mostly uses private investor funds. It's not taxpayer funded. So
yeah.
when I was talking about the bill, I said, it should get little to no resistance in Congress, and it should be able to pass. So I wanted to ask you, what's the status of the bill? Have you met any resistance so far? And if so, what has been their argument against this bill?
Well, all good will be attacked. That's one of the things I've learned in life. All good will be attacked, and we have to expect attacks. Some people don't like it because I'm the sponsor. Some people don't like it because Corey's the co-sponsor. People just don't like some things just because. They don't have to have a good reason. But I will say I've been met with a lot of optimism about the bill. People want to tweak it and change it some here and there, and I'm happy to have an open conversation. One person made a suggestion that was a great suggestion, that beyond distressed communities, when these natural disasters come through, like hurricanes or tornadoes, maybe that the governor could designate a specific community that has just gone through a catastrophic occurrence as a part of the distressed communities. And I like that definition as well. So we are still going through the process of trying to engage our friends on both sides of the aisle. The biggest opposition that I keep hearing has to do with the fact that I'm giving the power to the governors and to the local government to make the decisions. And in my opinion, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. People trust the government closest to them more than they do the federal government. So I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to succeed, and I don't need the power, I don't need the influence, and I don't need the credit. I just need something to change. And so my goal is to make that change happen.
I'm so glad you mentioned local government. That's a point me and Frank, we really try to drive home, because a lot of people feel like there's no difference in who to vote for president or Congress or whatever. And while we do try to tell them that there is a difference and you should vote in that, local elections are just as important. And like you say, they really, I think they affect you much faster than federal government.
I think you're right. I have served on the local level. I've served on the state level. I'm now on the federal level. I will tell you that your most immediate impact from government comes from your local city and county councils, who are in a position to impact your trash, your roads, your vehicle registration fees, your property taxes, your law enforcement response. Thank God for people like you who will serve this nation in uniform, putting your life on the line. God bless you for doing so. The fact of the matter is that most of those decisions and most of the funding does not come from the federal level. We can provide some grant funding, but the reality of it is it's your local tax base that is making the investment to keep your community safe, that makes sure that the EMS comes when you hit 911, making sure that your local malls and grocery stores are properly secured and that the lights work. I mean, so many of these decisions are absolutely not federal decisions. And that's why I like to present to the local government and the state government the opportunity to be in charge of things like the Investing in Opportunities Act.
I feel like you are an interesting politician. You beat what I feel like is the most popular name in South Carolina. As I stated in the beginning, you're one of 2 African Americans in the Senate. And by and large, Democrats enjoy about a good 90% of the vote from black people. As you answered Frank's question, you spoke why you are a Republican, and and why the Republican Party would be good for minorities. My question is, have you at all urged your party to, because I think the message gets missed from a lot of black people and minorities as far as what the Republican Party does. Have you urged your party at all to, as far as more outreach to get minority support? Because a lot of black people don't want to vote for Democrats all the time. They just feel like they have to because the Republican Party isn't appealing to them. So have you at all urged your party to reach out more?
I certainly have. I mean, I've had a number of conversations with the National Party that I think has done a better job in the last 2 years than it has in the last 4 or 5 years. But progress is slow. The ability to stereotype an entire race of people or entire political party is very easy to do, unfortunately. We have seen that happen as African Americans. We've seen that happen. I've seen that happen as a Republican. But the real key is what Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about so many years ago, the content of character versus color of skin. Please judge me as an individual. I think we should all decide to judge people as individuals. And frankly, I'm not suggesting that everybody should join the Republican Party. I'm suggesting that we should be open-minded in how we select who will represent us. And if we have an allegiance 90 to 95% of the time to one party, we are politically becoming more irrelevant to both parties.
Well said. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, Investing in Opportunity Act is his bill. You can visit scott.senate.gov/opportunity agenda for more information. I'm sorry about your Spurs, by the way, Senator. But
man, it hurt my heart, bro. It hurt my heart.
But thank you for coming on, sir.
Well, thank you for twisting the knife, brother. Have a good day.